Sure, let's make a go of it.
Okay, so welcome. Thanks for joining us to our live lecture, Knowing in Your Mind, Insights from Neuroscience.
As you can see, we're live. We're here on campus at Middlesex University. Alex and I are streaming this from one of our psychophysiology labs, and we're hoping to tell you a little bit about psychology and neuroscience, which is both what we teach.
Yeah, so who are we? Well, I'm Alex Jones, this is John Silas, and we are both senior lecturers in the psychology department. And I suppose we call ourselves cognitive neuroscientists. So we use a lot of neuroscience in our teaching and also research to try and figure out stuff about the brain and the mind and how we do our thinking.
So both of us classically trained in psychology, really. We did our undergraduates in psychology, our postgraduates in psychology, and then went on to specialize within a subdiscipline, as Alex says, cognitive neuroscience, trying to say something about the way psychology works, about the mind by looking at the brain. And today, really, what we want to do is give you a sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the stuff that we find particularly interesting in cognitive neuroscience, really just to give you a kind of taste of the sort of stuff that Alex and I teach on a regular basis, but give it to you in an introductory level so that you have a kind of feeling of what learning about cognitive neuroscience and what certain aspects of psychology is like in higher education.
Yeah, and as we've mentioned a few times now, but if you joined us late, so if you do have questions, then do please post them. And Jack will monitor the Q&A and we'll get to them right at the end.
Yeah, we've left some space for that.
Right, so I mean, starting off, we do, as I say, cognitive neuroscience. So there's a lot of things like attention, memory, and some things we quite often think about. So how do we recognize objects? And something we teach here as well. How do you recognize objects? And this is one of these things where we all do it, and we're very, very good at it. But once you start thinking about how we do it, and all of a sudden it gets very complicated quite quickly. And it's one of these things. I kind of think of it as the more you know you don't know.
So I think a lot of psychology is often criticized for demonstrating experimentally or demonstrating with evidence that something we thought we already know. But actually this low level basic function that we have, an ability to recognize objects in our environment, turns out to be quite a complicated thing.
So yes, I mean, so the simplest way to look at it, how complicated. So there are no points for guessing what it's on screen. So you see a pineapple, but obviously you'll recognize that instantaneously, even if it different angles, different shapes, different sizes, if it's light, if it's dark, and you need all sorts of things. You need kind of memory and attention and perceptions to recognize objects. So that's one we can start thinking about. Well, how do we recognize objects? And to start off by kind of digging a bit deeper, thinking, well, how do we recognize objects? Well, it's visually, a lot of object recognition is to think about, well, how does vision happen in the brain? And maybe that gives us some insights. And very briefly, the way vision works in the brain, very brief overview is obviously you got your eyes, so light comes into the eye, hits the retina, and basically what it does, our kind of nearly first point of contact, the first processing is right at the back of the head. So it goes from the eye all the way to the back to the occipital lobe. And this is where we have the primary visual cortex. And that's our first basic visual processing when you see an object, whether it be a chair, a cup, or a person, a face, or so on.
So we're real visual animals. So a large part of our brain is dedicated to just processing visual information. A large part of the occipital lobe, right at the back of the brain, is dedicated just to visual processing.
And kind of, if we look a bit further, so what happens then to visual information? Like, does it stay there? No, it doesn't stay there. It kind of propagates forward in the brain. And actually, if you look at visual information, then it kind of two actual fiber bundles also. One kind of goes a bit more up to the top, more anteriorly, and one goes a bit more kind of down to the bottom, a bit ventral stream. And what we think, or what research has done in psychology and neuroscience, is actually thinking, well, these two pathways they deal with two fundamental questions we have when we deal with object recognition. And those two questions we think these pathways do is, one is, where are we looking? Okay, so we need to be able to recognize an object. We need to know where it is. And the other obvious one is, what is the object? So what and where seems to be two fundamental questions when it comes to understanding object recognition. And this is kind of beyond our first primary visual cortex and going on to do some more deeper processing. And on the screen here, you just have this kind of diagram again, and we call them the what and the where pathway, or the ventral or the dorsal stream. And we think that they represent two fundamental questions about how we recognize objects.
You got that ventral pathway is at the bottom of the brain. Ventral refers to the bottom part of the brain, which is the what pathway, and dorsal is the top part of the brain, which you think of, where it's the where pathway. So
yes, and I suppose me and John are quite used to looking at pictures of brains, but just to kind of navigate this picture a little bit. So as you go on the left-hand side, the frontal lobe is this lobe we have at the front. Temporal lobe sits below and very important for object recognition. And the parietal lobe kind of sits a bit more on top, and the occipital lobe at the back, the one in greeny bluey at the back, that's where we have the primary visual cortex. Okay, so we think we got these two pathways, and they deal with two fundamental questions, what and where, about recognizing objects.
But you might reasonably ask, what evidence do we have to suggest that these two pathways do separate kinds of object recognition?
Oh, good cue.
Thanks.
Wow. Well, one way you can get at this is to understand what happens when it goes wrong in the brain. So we call this insights from patients, patient studies. And that's basically when people, unfortunately have some kind of brain damage as a result. It's quite often a stroke or an accident. And all of a sudden, they're still functioning, but all of a sudden they can't do a specific thing. And then you can, with some imaging, maybe we can look at this later. John will talk to you about imaging, see, well, what part of the brain is damaged and what can't they do? And this is exactly what you can find out when it comes to object recognition, for example. So you have something called visual agnosia. So I had a patient called CK. So he's a British guy, I think, who was out for a run and unfortunately struck by a motorcycle. And had some brain damage. And basically what happened was that bits of his temporal lobe, so you can see which we've highlighted with the big X, that was damaged. Okay, so you had some brain damage, so that part of the brain is not functioning anymore. Importantly, his vision is fairly okay. You can walk around, can see things, you can ask, which is longer, this line versus this line. So fairly low level visual stuff is okay. Now, the problem is that patient CK had something we call visual agnosia. So you do some testing and then you say, what is this? And you present an object and they can't recognize this object. So visual agnosia is failure to recognize objects. So specific for CK, you presented this abacus and said, well, what is it? And then he looked at it and go like, so you can see something is there, tell some colors apart and so on, but then go, And I think his response to this was some kebab skewers. Okay, so you can see the lines and the stuff on it, but can't actually recognize, integrate the whole thing.
It's a really interesting problem that we see with CK. It's not that any of the vision is disrupted. They're able to identify colors, able to identify where the object is. But when asked to identify it, seemingly can't take that image and use it to state what is in front of them.
And that is, again, so what you do is you relate this back to the brain and look at his brain in particular, and you can see that his what pathway is damaged. And that's one way to get at the link and then try and understand, well, how do we do object recognition? The theory was that the ventral stream is object recognition, and when that's damaged, you do see that people fail to recognize objects. And you can also see that CK was good at drawing maps and can kind of tell where things are because his where pathway was intact. So moving on, so another quite famous case study. So a patient called DF also had visual agnosia, and this is actually her brain. So DF was a Scottish woman, I believe so, and she was a translator in Italy, and then she suffered some carbon monoxide poisoning, which damaged her brain, some leaky gas heater or something like that. We won't go into detail about her brain scans here, but importantly, take our word for it that basically her what pathway is damaged. So she suffered from visual agnosia, and actually very severe visual agnosia. So you'd present a mug in front of her or a cup, and she'd say, oh, I don't know, I can't see, maybe it's got a little round thing, I don't know. So very basic objects, unfortunately, patient DF couldn't recognize.
It's worth pointing out these kinds of brain damage are very rare. Usually when we get into an accident, we damage our brain very broadly or suffer trauma across the whole head, or damage parts of the body. These very specific lesions that only damage a small part of the brain are really useful for neuropsychologists to ask questions about the functioning of the brain, are very unusual.
So I mean, to be fair, these patients were we call them by their initials to keep them anonymous, which is very important. They also, they become quite famous because, as John says, they have a lot of, they have a specific damage, which has then affected a specific behavior. Okay, where are we? We are patient DF, our Scottish woman who's got some damage to her ventral pathway, which is the what pathway. Okay, now, great, she's got, well, great isn't, but she's got visual agnosia, and quite severe one. She can't recognize objects if you just present them to her. Now, interesting what Goodell and Milner, what they did. So they did a lot of experiments, work with patient DF to try and understand better this what and the where pathway. And what they did, okay, so they present all these objects and say, I can't see what it is. And they say, okay, well, what is this? And they presented it basically like a letterbox, something you got on the screen here. And this letterbox is a bit special. You can orient the opening as you want. So you can turn it around basically. And then you ask patient DF and said, okay, well, can you tell me what orientation the letterbox is now? So you kind of orient it around, as you say, I have no idea, I can't see it. I don't understand what it is. What is it? Is a letterbox. So basically say, okay, no idea what it is. And I say, okay, that's fine. Now, humorous, well, here's a letter, why don't you post it? And it should say, right, slightly ridiculous, I can't even see what I'm doing, so why would I post this, or how would I be able to post this letter? Now, lo and behold, the interesting bit is that patient DF can post a letter perfectly.
At any orientation.
At any orientation. Doesn't matter how you're oriented. She can post it, but she's not aware that she can see the letterbox opening.
A really dramatic case study where very unusual patient absolutely reported no visual awareness of there being a letter or a letterbox, and yet could respond perfectly.
And this is what Goodell and Miller kind of figured out was actually, let's not just think, we got our what pathway, which was damaged with patient DF, but the where pathway, we should think about, it's not just a static scene, like where is this and where is that? Actually, what we do a lot with our vision is interact. We interact with objects and we interact with the world. So actually this where pathway is a lot to do with, it's our motor system. It guides our motor system operating without awareness. So patient studies, a couple we looked at here, some good evidence of how object recognition works. And you can see that in some cases you do get this visual agnosia when people, they can see, they've got visual sense of the world, but they can't recognize object, they can't put the object together. And in particular, we saw from patient DF that we can understand that actually our aware pathway, our visual system operates a lot beyond our awareness. And for example, this this guy playing tennis here, and it kind of makes sense. If if you're aware of all your actions you're doing and running, then you wouldn't think about much else. So there's a lot of our visual input which guides our actions, which we don't think about so much. Okay, yeah, so another thing we can think about is another object we can think about, I suppose, is faces.
Faces are a special kind of object, if you like. It's because we see and interact with faces on a daily basis, perhaps more than we do with any other object. And also we use faces to be able to garnish certain types of information. We get identity information, who the person is that we're talking to, from faces. And we also get emotional information from faces. They convey an emotional expression, and we use that to inform our social interactions. And so in that sense, because of their commonality and because of the information we get from faces, they seem to have a privileged space in this, in object recognition.
So yeah, the question is, so are they special, and do we use kind of a specialized system for them? Yeah, to look at the faces on the screen here. So on the left, we don't have John. This is Brad Pitt.
We're often confused.
Often confused. Stephen Fry and the Crown Princess of Sweden, Victoria. Now, the reason we put these on is just because all of them have kind of maybe self-reported to some degree that they have some issues with recognizing faces, but have all done very well in any case. Right, so is there a specialized system when it comes to faces? And what we'd like you to do here is to say, well, do you recognize these two people? Obviously, they're upside down. That's not a mistake. And we hope you can recognize them. Can you recognize them, John?
Just about. Two very well-known people in our modern world. On the left, you've got Donald J. Trump himself, and on the right, you've got Kanye West. And I think the important thing to notice here is that you can recognize these faces, you can get identity information from them. And I think also at first glance, hopefully all of you think they look pretty normal. Now, that exact image, we're not altering the image at all. We're going to turn the right way around.
Ta-da. And then you see some slightly disturbing images here. But as John says, we are not tricking you. We're not, experts in any kind of Photoshop. So these are just the images you just saw upside down. The next slide, I've got them side by side here, so you can just see, and obviously turn your phone around if you want, or your head, to figure this out. Now, what's going on here? Well, basically, we have this specialized system when it comes to faces. So we're so good at recognizing these faces, but it's when they are the right way up. When we turn them the upside down way, then basically we can't use this specialized system, and we have to treat them as a novel object. And then treating this as a novel object, all of a sudden, we're actually not very good at picking up the small differences, which are huge. Obviously, if someone walked around like Trump on the left there, then, he wouldn't be voted in as president, I'm sure. But it's, it's scary looking, but we can't use the specialized system when we look at upside down. So we have to revert back to a non-specialized object-based
So all that's been done to modify these very weird looking faces is that the mouth themselves have been.
I think the eyes as well. Yeah. Another way to look at faces and are they special is to again look at case studies of patients, and we're going to look at 3 people who have something which is called face blindness. So we call it Prosopagnosia. And again, this tells us something about that faces are special, because these people, they can't recognize faces very well. They can recognize objects. So they haven't got visual agnosia, but they struggle to recognize faces.
Again, a result of a unusual damage to a very specific part of the brain.
So we'll run this and see them recognizing some faces. Yeah, countdown. Take a sip of coffee.
We won't be watching 14 minutes.
Who's that?
No. Oh, no. Trying to visualize it with hair. No.
Are you sure you don't recognize that person?
No.
No. Give me a hint.
You should know this person.
give me a hint.
Think about it.
No. First name?
Steve.
No.
It's me.
No. Really?
Yeah.
It's you? I can't believe that. I cannot relate that picture to you at all.
Not at all.
No, not at all.
Really, honestly, that does not look a thing like you.
Okay, so what you can see there, so these three individuals, they have something called prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness, and it's quite severe. And it's a very interesting phenomena. They quite often get through life in other different ways, recognize hair, people, and beards and so on. But this prosopagnosia does show that you've got this special bit of the brain. Well, it shows you've got a special face processing system. And also, you can look at these individuals and see where damage is. And there seems to be a very particular part in the brain called the fusiform face area, obviously named after recognizing faces, which if you specifically damage this area, then you struggle to recognize faces. But again, objects can be preserved, so you can be fine in recognizing objects.
Cool. So as well as using case studies to inform our understanding of the relationship between brain and psychology and functioning in day-to-day life, the recent advent of neuroimaging has brought about a massive advantage in us being able to peer inside the minds of typically developing brains. We don't have to look at damaged brains. One of the most well-known advances in the past few decades has been the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI for short. fMRI gives us the opportunity to put an individual inside a machine and non-invasively, that means without any damage, without having to cut them open, allows us to record and measure activity of the brain from a typical, normal, healthy participant while they engage in some task, in some psychological resource. And fMRI has really pushed forward our understanding of the brain and how it relates to everyday functioning, like object recognition, for example. We can use fMRI to kind of support some of the insights to brain functioning that we've garnished from neuropsychological case studies. So you saw, Alex told you about specific case studies where a damage to the fusiform face area results in this face blindness. We can now take typical, healthy, normal developed individuals, put them inside an fMRI machine and ask them to look at faces. And we see the same area light up to the area that was damaged in our face blinded participants. So we can confirm and support the notion that this region of the brain really is specific to face processing.
And it's worth pointing out, we do get these very pretty pictures that you got on the screen where there's only one little bit lights up. Now, the whole brain is active all the time. So it's not just this particular bit, but what we tend to do is we compare faces, in this case, quite often houses, faces and houses being one of these comparisons. They look a little bit the same. And you pointed out earlier that they also, we see them a lot. We see faces a lot, we see houses a lot. So this is a contrast, a comparison between faces and houses. And then you see this little dot light up.
It's really important for us to dispel this common myth that only 10% of your brain is active at any given moment. It's complete nonsense. What you see on the screen is a contrast image. This region is especially active for faces in comparison to houses. Now, fMRI is an incredible technique, but more broadly, MRI has allowed us to do some really inventive things in looking at inside the brain. As well as looking at blobs of activation, we're able to use MRI to scan the connection between brain cells, to look at the fibers that connect them, to scan and look at the neurotransmitter makeup of the brain in specific regions as well. So fMRI is this incredibly versatile piece of equipment that is still giving us new insights into how to study the brain. And one of these new insights comes from a technique that's really borrowed from the computer science, and an approach to analyzing data that has really been quite profound. Now, both Alex and I work in neuroimaging, and we typically use a technique called EEG that we're going to tell you a little bit about as well. And we bring participants, typically developing participants, into the lab, and we put a machine on them and we record their brain activity while they engage in a task. And one question that we get very, very regularly when participants, commonly undergraduate students, come into the lab and we're putting on the equipment, getting ready to measure their brain activity, they often turn to us and ask, can this machine read our thoughts?
Quite nervously.
Quite nervously.
Can you read what I'm thinking?
Can you tell what I'm thinking? And we always reassure them that no, your own experience is private and no amount of clever machinery will ever be able to peer into the mind of you. Now, we've had to reverse some of those statements because of the recent developments, particularly in pattern analysis. So classically, what happens in fMRI is an individual comes in, they're put inside an MRI scanner, and they're given a task to engage with. So in this case, we might present them with looking at faces. The brain is then digitized inside the scanner, and we get a level of activation for every millimeter cubed or so. So we carve up the brain into little cubes, and for each cube, we get a measurement of how active it is at any given moment. And that gives us the pretty pictures that we've been talking about. We can contrast it to other conditions and show, for example, that the fusiform face area lights up when you're looking at a face. But this approach is very coarse in nature. It requires us to look at large chunks of brain, and we lose the pattern of activation that happens as a function of time. Instead of looking at these blobs of activation, what we can do is look at the complicated pattern of brain activation as time goes on. We can then use that pattern analysis to read information inside the brain or inside the mind of the individual.
I suppose one thing to take is that neuroscience in particular is one of these areas which it is rapidly evolving because, technology is rapidly evolving, and computer power and the way we, collaborate with computer scientists, AI, that kind of stuff. So things are, we can do more and more things quite quickly compared to even 5-10 years ago.
Absolutely. So the clip I'm going to show you now is one of pattern analysis. It requires a little bit of explanation before it starts showing. On the left side of the screen, what you have is a clip that was shown to the participants while they were having their brain scanned inside an MRI machine. That data from their brain was then given to a pattern analysis machine. That pattern analysis machine then used the brain data to reconstruct what they thought the participant was looking at. So what you have here is a machine that is doing mind reading. It is trying to generate the image that the participant themselves were looking at while they were inside the scanner, and only from the brain data. The machine had, the pattern analysis machine had no other information available to it. Now, so that's what you're seeing on the right. Now you can see it's not a perfect representation of what the individual was looking at, but it's incredibly close. We are coming very, very close to being able to use machines to extract information sufficiently accurate enough to sort of read the mind of the participant. Really mind-blowing stuff. Okay, so using MRI to read the minds of individuals is another incredible insight that we've had from cognitive neuroscience over the past decade or so. As well as that, there is a kind of applied side to some of the stuff that we do. Using brain neuroimaging machines to control devices in the environment. This technique is called brain-computer interfaces, or BCI. You'll all know what a human-computer interface is. It's a keyboard, it's a mouse, it's a touchscreen, it's a joystick. It's the sort of things that you use to control a computer or to control a device. Now, of course, doing that still requires your brain. You think about what you want to do, it sends signals down to your hands, your muscles contract, and you input some information to a machine. BCI hopes to bypass the usual output of your volition, of your control, and instead of controlling a machine with your hands, to simply control a machine through your brain activity by thinking about it. This has recently been in the news because Elon Musk has suggested or has put out an idea he calls Neuralink, where he hopes soon that every individual will be able to have some implant that allows them to control a device. It's interesting to note, this made a big splash all over the TV, you may have come across it. It's interesting to note that the things he was proposing actually aren't that novel. Science has kind of had this technology for some time. What was new and interesting about Elon Musk's idea was the idea that it would be democratized, available to a lot of people, and the surgery would be automated. But let's put that to one side. The idea here is that we can take brain activity and use it to control the machine. This was first demonstrated in animals, really, where we record brain activity from a monkey and then use that brain activity to control a device in the environment. So the video I'm about to show you has a monkey where the brain activity is being measured. The monkey's hands are restrained and the brain activity is directly connected to a robotic arm. And as you'll see here, the monkey, with its brain activity, with a high degree of precision, acuity, and speed, is able to move the robotic arm, grab a piece of food, and then bring it to its own mouth.
So yeah, so the monkey's arm is not in this big kind of metal arm. This is completely separate and only driven by the monkey's mind, essentially. So you are cutting out the movement of the hand. So it's just a mind to machine interface, and so it's surprising what you can do when you are hungry. Yeah.
To be able to do this in human beings, there are a number of things that we need. Using an fMRI machine obviously isn't very practical because an fMRI machine requires almost an entire room, is not portable at all, and the individual has to be still and lying down. It's not really useful to control a machine only when you're in an MRI machine. Instead, we looked at neuroimaging techniques that are a little cheaper, a little bit more portable, and a little bit more temporally precise. And in fact, one of the oldest neuroimaging techniques available to us is something called electroencephalography, or EEG.
You have probably heard of this, and this is where you stick a load of electrodes on the scalp, as you can see we're doing there. And then you basically record the brain activity under each one of those electrodes, because you can, on the scalp, you pick up tiny bits of electrical activity. And this is to point out, this is something that me and John use a lot, not only in, well, we do it in research, but this is something we teach our students as well. And here at Middlesex, we do give the students an opportunity to kind of hands-on get experience of using EEG to record brain activity, amongst other things as well. But
so importantly, EEG is this measure of electrical activity. And fundamentally, the way that our brain communicates, it processes information, is electrical in nature. And by putting these sensors on the surface of the scalp, we're able to pick up some of that electrical activity and infer the brain activity that's happening under the scalp. Really, really useful. No harm, no damage is done to the patient. It's just like wearing a kind of skin cap, maybe a little messier because we use a bit of gel. And some of you will be familiar with some of the activity that we record using EEG. In effect, we get brain waves, waveforms, electrical activity in the shape of sinusoidal waveforms, typical waveforms, at different frequencies that are commonly chopped up into frequency bandwidths known as alpha, beta, delta, theta, and gamma as well. And these waveforms, each one of these waveforms will do something different or will respond differently to a particular psychological function. One of those particular signals that we're interested in as a lab, but also is broadly very interested in, is the alpha rhythm. The alpha rhythm can be picked up over the motor cortex. And as we know from now decades of research, we are contralaterally wired. That is to say, our left side of our brain controls the right side of our body, and the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body. And when we make a movement, this alpha signal changes. If we move our right hand, then the alpha signal on the left side of our brain changes, and vice versa. The really useful thing about this particular signal is not only does it change when we make a movement, but it also changes when we imagine making a movement. And so if for whatever given reason we can't move one of our arms or both of our arms, we can still see that signal change in the brain. And so if we had an individual who was unable to control their arms for whatever reason, disease or accident, or just they were occupied and they were doing something else, then we're able to extract that signal. We can place an individual inside a wheelchair, measure their EEG, and look for that signal. If you imagine moving your hand to the right, we can program the wheelchair to turn right. If you imagine moving your left arm, then we can program the wheelchair to turn left. And that's exactly what you're going to see in this video now. You have an individual with their EEG being measured, wired up to a wheelchair. As they imagine moving their left hand, the wheelchair turns left. As they imagine moving their right hand, the wheelchair turns right.
Yeah, so this kind of EEG setup we got here is something we use as well, quite a lot. So as John says, it's very versatile, and there's a lot of, to get to this point where you're moving wheelchairs, we do all this kind of fundamental research. You need to first figure out, well, what does change when you're thinking about moving left and right, and when you're remembering or doing different things. So
you can see the possible future extensions of such a device. As well as being able to control a wheelchair, we might imagine an exoskeleton, or might imagine controlling a device that you couldn't use while your hands were occupied. And so there is a great deal of interest in brain-computer interfaces very broadly as well. Okay, I think that's largely our whistle-stop tour of some exciting, hopefully interesting things that we find in cognitive neuroscience. Obviously, Alex and I do a lot more than that, and a lot more technical nitty-gritty stuff as well. Our teaching is a lot broader as well. But we thought those would be an interesting taster for you guys there.
So yeah, a lot of the things I think we've got is that we are, I suppose this comes together in cognitive neuroscience, and this basically where we start. We sit in the psychology department, so we always start with the questions that, well, how do people think, or how do they attend or focus to something? How do they make decisions? How remembering? Actions. We talked a little about how do people perform as the action, and obviously we haven't talked much about socializing. But these are the kind of questions we have, and then we use these neuroscience techniques to try and figure out what goes on in the brain, trying to better understand them.
Yeah, it's very important. We're not just basic neuroscientists. As Alex says, we sit in a psychology department, and our interest lies first and foremost with the mind. We ask these questions: how do we perform these psychological functions? And sometimes we can get better insights, we can get better answers to those questions, not just by observing behavior, not just by talking to people and asking them to fill in questionnaires, but looking at their brain and seeing how it responds to our changes, to our experimental manipulations, under very specific conditions. And doing that allows us to contribute to our understanding of us as psychological beings. Neuroscientists will really be interested in the brain for the sake of understanding the brain. Cognitive neuroscientists are interested in the brain for the sake of what it can tell us about people, of who we are as human beings.
Okay, yes, so that's a whistle-stop tour of a few things that at least we find interesting. But we thought we'd mention a couple of things about the teaching and learning plans for next year in our department.
So we're very aware that this has been a particularly unusual year, and the global pandemic means there's a lot of uncertainty for everyone. And I've done a few of these online things, and almost entirely exclusively the questions are about what's it going to be like next year. So some of the things we can tell you that we've done this year that we will keep and we will keep in place that has worked really well, but also some things that we're hoping to have in place next year. We're hoping for the majority of workshops and seminars and lab sessions, you'll be in situ on campus. And we'll be able to show you some of this equipment, we'll be able to talk it through with you, we'll be able to give you a kind of hands-on experience of how it works. But things like lectures, where there's typically a large cohort of people in a big room all sitting very closely together, are likely to move online. So this kind of thing will probably stay online, and that we think has a lot of benefit as well. We can record it, you can watch it back, you can watch it at a later time.
Watch it again and again.
And again, yeah.
I think we try, so kind of reassure you that we are thinking, you know, as a department, as a university as a whole, really thinking about, you know, what we're taking the best bits from maybe the online world and the best bits from our on-campus bit, and then trying to merge them to get a good experience next year. So we've learned a lot this year, you know, Zoom meetings, Zoom lectures and that kind of stuff, but Zoom life. But it's taking those best bits and integrating them, and I think we'll do a good job of that next year.
One of my favorite best bits that has worked really well for me this year is having online office hours. I classically used to have on-campus office hours and would make sure I was there and in person and was rarely visited. But with my Zoom office hours, people feel much more free to pop in and ask me, even if it's just a quick question or have a lengthier discussion. They work really well for students. Yeah, so we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. We're happy to take any kind of questions. If you want to ask us about brains, we'd be super happy. But if we also completely understand that you might want to ask us a little bit about the experience of being on campus or anything about the psychology degree, we'll do our best to answer.
Yes, so should we, well, you got some phone, or should we invite Jack back in to maybe read some questions out?
Oh, there's some great questions that aren't about teaching, they're about psychology. Let's have a look. Wow.
Do you want to read them out, John, or do you want me to ask you both? It's up to you.
I've got them. Well, I'll ask them to each other. Thanks, Jack.
Sure.
So, well, these are questions we're struggling to answer. So, if depression is the reason for short-term memory and hardly remembering, is there a way to stop it? So, so there is a relationship between depression and memory. I'm not sure there's necessarily a causal relationship, so that depression and memory don't necessarily cause each other. But there are many people, unlike ourselves, more clinically orientated neuroscientists who do look to work to generate memory aids or of course, treat depression in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, so I mean, so John said just that specific questions about the link. Yeah, there is a link, but you obviously get people with depression who don't have these necessarily memory deficits. So depression is very broad and memory is also very broad. But we can also say we have a BSc in psychology with neuroscience where we work, and you'll have lectures together with clinicians in the natural science department, which work more with these clinically oriented questions as well.
I've got a good question for you, Alex, because Alex and I have recently delved into the field of memory researchers in collaboration with another colleague in the class. So we do a bit of memory research ourselves, and this is a good one. How can we recall information? Is there an easy way to stick information into the brain for as long as possible? Rhythm?
There are a lot of ways, and as I said, it depends you know, what kind of memory, you know, procedural memory, declarative memory. I think we often talk about encoding. So this is, I think, the question is, so making space so you can encode things in a very shallow way or in a deep way. And a deep way is tying some meaning towards something you want to remember. That tends to stick longer compared to something which is just like you don't attach much meaning. It's a bit fleeting. So yes, there are many different ways, but if you want to look further into levels of processing, that might be a good start.
It's also worth pointing out that we have in the department an expert on memory who runs a specialized final year optional module on memory, where she talks about the neuroscience and the cognition of memory as well. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you have the opportunity to specialize in your final year. Great. Here's a good question. I'll ask it to you and then you can ask it to me. What did you study and what pathway did you take into your position now? Very similar, actually.
Yeah, we did very similar. Yeah, so I did a BSc in straight psychology at City University. I went on to do masters in cognitive neuroscience at UCL, and then did a PhD and then some research work, and then ended up here basically.
Yeah, very similar. I did my undergraduate degree in straight psychology at the University of Surrey. I went straight on to do a PhD at the University of Roehampton. I did a postdoc fellowship abroad in the States. We both did something like that. And then I got a lecturing job first at Roehampton and then moved here in 2016. So yes, very psychology orientated, both of us, but specialized at the end in cognitive neuroscience. This is a good question as well. Is neuroscience in every psychology course, even on the counselling one? Yes. In short, yes, neuroscience, and at least an element of neuroscience is in every psychology course, because all of our psychology courses are BPS accredited, and the BPS require us to teach some biological psychology, and invariably biological psychology requires some understanding of the brain. That's not to say that if you do the psychology with neuroscience course, there's quite a lot more of neuroscience in it.
Yeah. So if you do decide on counselling this, you won't. Basically, you can choose a little bit, and we will expose you and teach you a broader kind of overview. And then the idea is that when you come to your third year, then you can specialise. What did you find interesting? And if it's neuroscience, then great. Me and John are there with open arms.
One of the really nice things about our psychology with counselling course that's worth pointing out is that in the second year, we teach the neuroscience component in a slightly different way to the counselling students. They have their own specialised module where they focus specifically on the neuroscience that is applicable to therapy and counselling.
But yes, it's not a huge part of counselling in neuroscience. We'll point that out maybe.
So this is a psychology course common to combine with a language? So I assume you mean studying a language. Here we don't offer that. We have straight psychology, psychology with education, neuroscience, education, neuroscience, criminology, counselling, and something else. But we don't offer the ability to study psychology with a language at this institution. Here's one for you, Alex. For people with visual agnosia who are unable to identify objects, how are their memories altered? That's a question. Or what prohibits them from retrieving the memories needed to identify the object?
That's a very good question. Now, it will, of course, so there's two parts to this. So learning new memories is going to be more difficult, object-related memories, if you can't really encode the objects properly. But a lot of people with visual agnosia, they've got intact memories. And one test you can quite often you do with people with visual agnosia and say, well, okay, what is this object here? And they won't be able to tell you. But then you say, draw me a flower pot. And there's no problem in drawing a flower pot. But they might not be able, once they've drawn it, they might not be able to recognize it, but when they get there in the end. So the memory seems to be intact, but it's usually the visual bit of seeing objects and integrating them into a whole. That seems to be the problem, not so much a memory one.
It really is a unique problem of recognition. You might even ask a patient with visual agnosia, what would you usually drink coffee out of? And they'd be able to say a cup and tell you what a cup looks like and what their favorite cup is. But if you put a cup in front of them, they wouldn't be able to.
And you can say it's a visual thing, but if they can hold a cup, they know it straight away it's a cup. So the tactile sense tends to be intact, and they can recognize objects that way.
Lots of questions. A very broad one. Dementia. How do you realize the extent of dementia within the brain? I did a bit of dementia research for my postdoc. Of course, it's an extremely varied subject. There are lots of different types of dementia that have different ways in which they damage the brain, different pathways, different progressions throughout the brain. So typically, the neuroscience of dementia tends to focus on one form of dementia at a time, try to, as neuropsychologists, typically look at the effect on psychological functioning and see if there are ways to ameliorate that. Neuroscientists might look more at the underlying mechanism, how the cells are damaged, how you could stop that progression of damage as they go through. There is, and we do a fair amount on dementia in the second and final year as well, if that's something you're interested in. Hopefully that's an answer. Yeah. If it's not, you can put another question. Is there any opportunity of starting psychology classes on campus next year? That's more of the questions I was expecting. Yes, we really, really hope that there is. Yes, we are planning to be on campus from September, October next year to deliver small group teaching, labs, workshops, seminars. We hope will all take place on campus.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's what we're planning for,
and that's what we want as well as academics and staff members. You know, we do really enjoy. I mean, the onlines work really well in some cases, but we really enjoy the face-to-face and the teaching, the seminars when we can have good discussions. So
yeah, what we think's missing is that kind of ability to sort of spontaneously interact.
Yeah,
that's sort of
so we are hoping for that as well, and planning to be on campus as well.
Yeah, very much so. Can a person both suffer from aphasia and agnosia? I think theoretically there's probably no reason they couldn't. I don't think there's a case study of it. I
don't know of a case study of it, and so these cases are quite specific. And usually, you might see someone with aphasia and visual agnosia, but they also might, you know, have more extensive brain damage and motor problems, and you know, so you don't. It's hard to really get at. But that's where the neuroimaging comes in, that we don't have to wait for these specific cases, but we can actually ask really good questions with healthy, typically developing individual participants, and then trying to get at how maybe aphasia or language areas and object recognition, how they work together.
Wow, thick and fast these questions. I'm afraid I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them. I'm going to try and...
Is there a rating? Did you say you can...
There is. I'm taking them in order.
Okay.
Voted. Yeah.
All right.
There's about 23 that we've got. 22 open at the moment. What I'm going to do is take another couple of interesting ones. I'm going to try and scan through and see if there's any critical ones. This is a difficult one. Is there a specialized area of the brain that causes deja vu?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I actually know a little. Well, there is some research that has attempted to look or actually generate experiences of deja vu, but because it's such a
unique phenomenon,
yeah, it's a really difficult thing,
rare phenomenon,
rare and unusual phenomena. It's a very difficult thing to capture while you're in a brain scanner. So you could put someone inside a brain scanner and wait and just say press a button as soon as you've had deja vu, and then we'll look inside your brain. But that's a very tricky thing to do. There has been some research that's tried to change brain states that and result in cause deja vu. It's a very little success. So it's a really difficult thing to know. Good question.
Yeah.
Would you recommend this course to someone who is struggling with mental health? That's a difficult question.
Well, all we can say, I think, is generally in the university, I think we do have a lot of services to support students in all kind of, whether it's academic or, you know, more personal mental health. So there is counselling, there is all sorts of services which students do use and can make the most of.
Yes, yeah. I wouldn't say that your own mental health should be a motivating force necessarily for you to take the course, but if you are interested in this more broadly, and you think you want a future career that's psychology orientated, then those are good reasons. If you do struggle, many people struggle with mental health. We have a wide array of support services, and we'll do our best to support you as much as we can.
John and Alex, just to let you know, we've been given the okay to add 10 minutes to the session just to get a few more questions.
Okay, cool. We'll keep going.
Who okayed that?
Yeah, I don't
That was above me.
That's fine. Thanks, Jack.
Do you believe, this is a good question, do you believe one day we'll be able to record or share dreams?
I mean, record your
Would you
pattern.
want to?
Well, yeah, would you want to?
So the pattern analysis stuff is the logical extension of pattern analysis is that, to the extreme, that in theory you should be able to record brain activity and reconstruct the experience that someone's going through. And that's kind of how I presented it to you as I was discussing pattern analysis. But there are a lot of complexities behind that and technical difficulties that really mean we aren't there yet.
I mean, one thing which I think sleep research more generally, not necessarily only dreams, but really it has done a lot when it comes to EEG. And this is the stuff, I suppose, is mine and John's speciality or expertise research area. So using EEG and the stuff we have here is you can see different stages of sleep, and then you can see when people are dreaming. So yes, I think there's no reason to say in the future it can't be done, because things are moving on very fast in neuroscience.
In the long term, possible, but maybe not in our lifetimes. So this is a more pragmatic question. If you're hoping to have seminars on campus, will students have to have the vaccine, or are you going to be operating tests every time students have to attend campus? I don't think we'll be doing either of those things. I don't think we'll be restricting, as you know, we're following changing government guidelines, and we're working to best approximations. But at the moment, there are no requirements to have a vaccine to be on campus. And at the moment, there's no requirement to have a negative test to be on campus. And as far as we're aware, that's what we're hoping to have in place in October. However, as is available to everyone, lateral flow tests will be made commonly available via the university. You can pick them up and you'll be encouraged to test it.
There is a testing center set up, a lateral flow testing center, where you can pop in and take a test, and we encourage a couple of times a week. So those facilities are there, but as John says, as far as we're aware at the moment, it's not planned to have this kind of like mandatory checking.
That's right. Alex and I have also delved, we haven't had a lab, but we've delved and done a little bit of research around COVID-19 and vaccine hesitancy. And as good scientists, it's probably worth saying, don't forget to get vaccinated when you get the opportunity to.
Oh, yeah.
How much of this subject covers mental disorders? So a large, or as you would imagine, a large section of psychology is about mental health issues, and we cover that in a variety of different ways. So a large section of psychology does cover mental health issues from different angles: biological ones, psychotherapeutic ones, social ones, and that's weaved into the fabric of the course. We don't separate that out. You don't have a special module on mental health disorders, but rather that's taught throughout in a variety of different ways.
So I mean, even the psychophysiology, we'll do the kind of more biological base things, or the neuroscience. Look at what happens when you get anxious, anxiety disorders, and we can look at changes in the psychophysiology. But again, as John said, it is kind of weaved in the fabric everywhere. So
it's really difficult to give a percentage.
It's not a percentage, and it's not just one module like schizophrenia. But it will be examples of people with dementia and Alzheimer's and schizophrenia, and
this is true. Will you please talk a little bit about the foundation year in psychology? Thank you so much for this webinar. You're welcome. The foundation year in psychology is a stepping stone into the main year. You have one module that covers the basics in psychology. I teach a lecture on it and introduce some neuroscience approaches. But as well as that, foundation year also covers some skilling you up in mathematics and English, so that your engagement with the statistics when you get here isn't too difficult for you, and your ability to write essays is easier as well. I will say, anecdotally, my experience is those who have come through the foundation year tend to do very well in the psychology degree. We really angle you towards developing the skills that you need to do well in the psychology program. So I hope that's I hope that helps a little bit. If you want to ask another one, go for it. Do you need specific A levels to allow you to study cognitive neuroscience? I thought you were going to say psychology, and that would have been an easy answer. No, not really, not even for psychology. I think things that would help if you were really interested in cognitive neuroscience, biology, computer science,
statistics.
Yeah.
I mean, but
Maybe some maths.
yeah.
But no,
No.
you can develop those skills later on in life. I can't even remember what it was like.
We do. I mean, obviously, our first year in anything with it, if you have psychology with neuroscience or psychology with counselling education, we kind of, the first year is a lot of the kind of like getting you up to speed and make sure everyone's got the necessary skills to kind of to specialize and to get a good foundation. You don't do foundation year.
This is a very broad question. We could be here all night answering this one, but we'll give it a go. What are the possible career paths for psychology? So many.
Yeah.
I often say to students that come into psychology that we have a large cohort of students. Psychology is a popular subject, and often people end up taking psychology because they're not so sure what they want to do in higher education. I think that's a good reason to take psychology. Psychology gives you a foundation in evaluating evidence, statistics, and also in writing. So the career paths available to you are equally just as broad. There are very specific ones. You can go on to train and become a clinical psychologist. You can go on and train to become a therapeutic psychologist, an occupational psychologist, a cognitive neuroscientist. There are many career paths available to you, but it also gives you a very good foundation in critical thinking, evaluation of evidence, and being able to write, which is valued in nearly every possible career, except for coal mining. in many careers. So yeah, without kind of going through every possible career.
I mean, yes. So I think, yes, to summarize, John says, you do get a lot of skills where employers really value. It's this kind of critical evaluation, not just taking things at face value, engaging, and a bit of being able to look at, administer questionnaires, remember to do a bit of statistics, write up reports, that kind of stuff. All of those things are things employers look at.
What would make, my wife asks me this, because my wife is head of a sixth form college. What would make a psychology personal statement stand out? I never know it's
I suppose an honest one is.
I think, yeah, an honest one is a good one. I think often what is overlooked in personal statements is the idea that what we're really trying to teach you, what we're really trying to look that you have an understanding for, is an ability to evaluate information, to have a critical eye on information. Just demonstrating that you're aware of the generation of information, of knowledge, of research, and that those skills are the ones that you're hoping to hone, that evaluative and critical reasoning. I think that would make me go, ooh.
Yeah, so critical evaluation is, as I said, not taking things at face value, and it is even more important these days with fake news and so on, is to think about, well, where is this from? Who said this? Is it backed up by science? Those kind of things are really things we look for.
Good. We now have a question that neither of us are qualified to answer.
Good.
What's the best way to cope with stress, apart from constructive coping, when it comes to defensive coping? So there are many psychotherapeutic approaches to dealing with anxiety and stress. I guess probably the most contemporary versions of those fall under the broad umbrella of positive psychology, something neither of us really are experts in. But positive psychology encourages positive self-reflection, not being critical to oneself, and gratitude, being happy for where you are and what you do, and practicing those.
And then we do have, we've got a few colleagues who do some teaching and research in that, so something that students get exposed to as well.
Yeah, I say we're not experts on it, but if you come in your first year here, I will be teaching you. So yeah, you'll hopefully some of that. We definitely tap into some of that. Our head of department here has fostered a well-being program that isn't just run within the department, but across the university, where we try and teach positive ways of interacting with stress. This is a question for me. Do you ever mention or take into consideration the philosophical aspects of how our brains function? perhaps how we might perceive the world quite differently than what it actually is, or other people see it. I won't read the rest of it, but yes.
You could have John talking for hours about this.
I'll talk to you for hours about
Is
that.
there free will? What is consciousness? This is
subjective experience. Yes. In fact, I spent last night reading a really long article on free will and subjective experience. Yes, it's a particular interest of mine, and also others in the department as well. We don't have a module that specialises in it, but any opportunity to talk about it, I will. And so yes, we spend a long time thinking about. Many of us spend a long time thinking about the philosophical implications and the philosophical framework within which our evidence contributes to. We aren't, partly because we're psychologists and psychology is based in theory as well as evidence. We don't blindly look at the evidence. We also engage in the implications that has for theory and the implications theory has on the evidence that we're generating. It's a very broad answer. I don't have time to.
Something to maybe say, there's a kind of a lot of questions seems to be asking about specific types of psychology. It sounds like, you know, a lot of you have a lot of specific interests, and something to kind of point out that, you know, you're in your third year, all our students need to do a dissertation. So you do a research project, which is a big part of your third year. But then we really encourage students to kind of, you know, choose a topic, do something that they're really interested in. So if you're interested in the consciousness, or whether it was dementia or agnosia or aphasia, then we do in the department have a lot of experience, and then try to, you know, make sure that you can do something that you really want to do, and you'll become a bit of a, you know, you'll become an expert in that particular field.
This is a good one as well. Which is better, psychology and neuroscience, or neuroscience only? Obviously psychology and neuroscience, but we're bound to say that. Depends where your interests lie. If you're interested in people, how they think, how they behave, and how they interact, do psychology with neuroscience. If you're interested in brains, the underlying chemical process, the anatomical makeup,
the synapses, the action potentials,
study neuroscience. If you want to be in a wet lab where you carve and look at things under a microscope, study neuroscience. If you want to be in a dry lab where you study human beings, and study psychology with neuroscience.
That's probably about 10 past. Any final?
Yeah, so John, I was going to say, because there's still quite a few questions. If it's all right with you, can I just fire you guys a couple more that are more related to the talk and not general? Just
absolutely, go for it.
Perfect. So someone wants to know, is visual agnosia degenerate?
So it depends. So visual agnosia itself isn't degenerative. It depends on how you acquired that visual agnosia. If you had a very specific damage by falling on a spike, then no, it's unlikely that would degenerate to other parts of the brain. If you had a malignant tumor in that area, feasibly it will degenerate.
And interestingly, it didn't go into this at all, but prosopagnosia, which was the face blindness, actually there is it's called congenital. So people are born with this prosopagnosia, face blindness, and they quite often don't realize that they are different to other people until very late on, because they've kind of learned different coping mechanisms. So it's not always a brain injury. So you can look at people with prosopagnosia, and they've actually, you can't see anything wrong with their brain.
I often claim to have congenital prosopagnosia when I can't recognize a student, but that's just me being terrible.
And someone would like to know how large the teaching groups will be, sort of generally looking forward, if you guys know the answer to that.
So we're hoping so it would depend on the classroom size, but I think we're looking at
around 20.
It will vary, but around 20-ish, depending on the module and the room that we're in, really. But it's like we definitely won't have large cohorts on campus. We're quite used to standing in big lecture theatres with a few hundred people, but we won't be doing that.
So what it means, it will run several sessions with, you know, a group of students. So there might be quite a few students on the program, but we'll run kind of several sessions, maybe, you know, 6, 7, 8, to make sure that we keep those numbers quite small.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I've just got 2 more fairly generic ones, if that's okay, guys. Someone would like to know what happens in sort of the foundation year, whether you'd recommend one of these and that sort of thing.
So the foundation year is you'll take one core psychology module where you get a very broad introduction to all types of psychology. And as well as that, you'll also get specialist training in maths and English, and it sets you up really, really well to take the undergraduate degree. So yeah, if you're not going straight onto the undergraduate degree, yeah, foundation year is an excellent one.
Perfect. And the follow-up links quite well to that, and it's just how much maths is needed for the degree, and is it quite a big part of it?
So, there's a couple of things that we should probably say about that. We're wholly aware that psychology students have aren't coming to take the degree because they have a love for statistics, and many of our students have an anxiety around engaging with that statistics. There's probably a couple of things to tell you about that. One, statistics really is important to understanding psychological research. Not only do we have to teach it to you as a BPS accreditation, but we feel it's fundamental for you to understand the broader topics that we're talking about. And two, don't worry. We're not going to make you do equations. We're not going to make you go back to your maths textbook and figure out exactly how to calculate partial letter squared. Rather, we're going to teach you how to engage with evidence, to use software that will do analysis for you. And it's the conceptual framework that you're going to have to get your head around, rather than the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, gone are the days of doing the hand calculations. So it's more the understanding to evaluate, how do we know that this group remembered better than this group? Well, we might have to do some kind of test. So we put that in through a software, and hopefully that gives us the answer.
Lovely, guys. Well, we'll have to call it there in terms of questions. I'll let you guys do your outro.
Well, thanks very much for coming. Like and subscribe. Oh no, we don't. Thanks very much. We hope it was useful. We hope it was interesting, and we look very much forward to seeing you on campus in the coming term.
Or the term after that. So the term after that.
If you want to contact us, you can find us we're on Twitter together, but you can also find us on the Middlesex website. Happy to take any questions. I've been John Silas.
Alex Jones.
We hope to see you next year. Thanks.